Hello and welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Patty Griffin with Wild Old Dog. And this week I am going to be talking about some recent science news. And the first thing I want to discuss is some recent research that has found that dog domestication probably occurred at a different time than we previously thought, and also in a different place. And if you're a regular listener of the show, then you'll know that I do occasionally talk about domestication and the different animals that we have domesticated and the different kind of time frames and places for all of these, and they're constantly being updated. And I did do a talk a while back where I was looking at all of these different species and comparing them, and it's amazing how just from when I first put that talk together a year or two ago, how many of these things have been updated, because molecular techniques are getting a lot better and researchers can look at these things in a lot more detail and cover many more different samples, and so they're able to become more and more specific about where exactly we domesticated these animals and which species were interacted with in order to create the domestic pets and agricultural animals that we're familiar with today. And basically, this recent research has done exactly that. It's used these new techniques in order to find out more information about a topic that was previously kind of inaccessible because there just weren't enough samples to test, and the samples that were around were quite old, so it was hard to get material from them. But now they've been able to look at a lot more things than they'd previously been able to consider. So in this previous study done by actually the authors of the current research, they were able to look at 6 different canine genomes, 3 from recently evolved wolf species from the Middle East, East Asia, and Europe, 2 ancient wolf breeds that have long since been extinct, and also from a modern variety of dog, in this case boxers. And what they expected when they did that was that they would find one wolf population that was clearly the closest relative to domestic dogs and would have been the population from which we would have domesticated these things. So humans a really long time ago may have taken in some of those wolves and bred them until they became the dogs that we know today. However, what they found then was that all of the wolves were falling out together into a single genetic group that was where all the individuals were related much more closely to each other than to any of the dogs, and the dogs were in a completely separate group. And this was quite unusual because all the samples that they had looked at covered a large geographical area that accounted for pretty much all of the potential centers for dog domestication, all the places that humans were known to be living in at that time. And this set of results suggested that there was some other population of wolves that were more directly related to dogs that had been interacted with in order to create the domestic animals that we know today, and that maybe this population was extinct, and that's why it hadn't been sampled, and that's why we weren't really aware of it. And so it simply hadn't been included in that specific study. And this is what made the researchers want to do a new study that included a lot more animals and a lot more potential relatives in order to understand kind of the phylogenetic tree, the family tree of all of these different species. So they've done this recent study where they've taken 10 ancient wolf-like animals, 8 dog-like animals, 77 domestic dogs, 49 wolves, and 4 coyotes. And all of the fossil species included were over 1,000 years old. Some of them were many thousands of years old, and some of them were even more than 30,000 years old. And so they have this huge range of different species from different places over a very different time span. And they were hoping that with this really large sample size, they'd finally be able to narrow their focus onto those animals that actually were the ancestors of dogs. And when they did the analyses, they focused on something called mitochondrial DNA. And that is a type of DNA that is easily extracted from both ancient and modern individuals. And so mitochondria are these little engine powerhouses that we have in all of the cells. And so for some reason, the DNA of these guys lasts for longer than nuclear DNA, so the DNA that all of us have within each of our cells that comes actually from us and from our parents. And so what they were doing was focusing on this in order to give them a very broad sample size. And what they found was that modern dogs were most closely related to a particular type of ancient wolves and also their descendants, some ancient dogs, that had been found in Europe rather than modern European wolves. And what this suggests is that there was a lineage of wolves way back in the day that humans were interacting with, and they bred the dogs from these, and the wolves themselves eventually went extinct. Now that's probably because the humans were breeding the wolves with the dogs, and so eventually all the pure wolves kind of were bred into the dog line, and the pure wolves that may have been left over that weren't breeding just kind of died out. And so this meant that the modern wolves were a completely separate thing that maybe evolved elsewhere off of a different lineage. They were completely separate from the ones that were used to make the dogs, and that's why we have these very distinct groups between the modern wolves and the dogs that we know today. And what's quite interesting about this is that some of these information, some of these data, kind of give you an idea of how and why humans might have domesticated wolves. And this is something that has always been cause for debate. And the lead investigator of the study believes that domestication was done by ancient people who were hunter-gatherers, not by ancient people who had just kind of learned how to be agricultural and had become sedentary and had settled in one place. And they think that that's probably the most likely thing, because when you've got this kind of hunting lifestyle, you would have had carcasses around, and you could imagine the wolves would have been coming in close to take advantage of those carcasses, and so they might have had contact with humans. They might have gotten closer and closer to the encampments as they were interested in having scraps. There might have been kind of multiple uses for wolves in that context, where they potentially could have helped with hunting, they could have helped with defense. You can imagine kind of in both directions, humans and wolves would have benefited each other, when they were around in pairs. But if you've got humans that are already settled in an agrarian sort of society, it would be much harder to suddenly introduce these large and aggressive predators into contact with the other humans that are in your settlement, with the other animals that you might have domesticated there. If you're spending all of your time trying to farm food, trying to farm vegetables and fruits, then you can't exactly see how a wolf would fit into that pattern. So the time scale here kind of suggests that it was the hunter-gatherers and not the farmers that would have come into contact with these animals and eventually domesticated them. And this is also something that kind of is explained by the genetic divergence as well. So if you had a group of wolves that were kind of following these hunting humans around and taking advantage of the carcasses, they would have been giving up their territories in order to do that. And if they would have given up their territories and kind of moved as a pack with the humans, they might have been less likely to interbreed with the wilder wolves that were still more territorial, more likely to breed with each other, and more likely then to kind of keep those domesticated traits that would have been emerging over time, kind of the tolerance of humans, or whatever other traits might have differentiated these kind of more human-friendly animals from their counterparts out in the wild. And in fact, this is something that we do kind of see in the wild even today. So there are some wolves that follow the caribou as they migrate, and these guys only interbreed with other wolves that are doing the same thing. They give up their territories, and they're only found kind of moving around in an itinerant way. And so they're quite different from those wolves that stay put year-round, even though they are related to those animals. So you could have had a very similar thing happening back in the past, only with humans instead of caribou. And this process may have also been influenced by the fact that back in the day you had different types of early wolves that were eating different prey. And this is known by isotope analysis that can kind of see what sorts of chemical signatures are left over by the foodstuffs that different animals were eating. So one thing we know is that there was something called a megafaunal wolf. And this is a large species of wolf that was preying on prey that were also quite large. So things like horses and bison and maybe even small mammoths. And some of the other wolves were specializing on other animals that were a bit smaller. And it's the megafaunal wolf that seems to be the type that gave rise to the modern dogs. So maybe it's those little ones that gave rise to the modern wolves that we know today, and it was these larger ones that were preying on the large prey that would have followed humans hunting the same things that gave rise to the dogs that we know. And one kind of funny thing about this study is that it does contradict some of the work that the authors have done in the past. So in their previous study, they found some indication that there was genetic similarity between Middle Eastern wolves and domestic dogs. And this made them suggest that perhaps domestic dogs were derived from Middle Eastern wolves, and that was the location of the domestication event, and those were the species that were used to create domestic dogs, if you like. But in fact, the reason that they thought this was that, they think that the reason that they thought this was that there is genetic information from those wolves in domestic dogs, but it's more likely a recent event. And what happened is that you've got dogs that have been domesticated, and then humans interbreed those with wolves. Or maybe the dogs are out kind of running feral a little bit, and they encounter wolves and then come back pregnant with puppies that are half wolf. Whatever the case may be, there was this later on occurrence where you have some wolf DNA being introduced. And actually researchers have found this around the world. Multiple different times we have found evidence that humans either accidentally or purposely allowed their dogs to interbreed with local wolves. And so what these guys said in their current paper was that they've probably dismissed this and not really thought that it happened all that often, when in fact it did. And their more recent evidence suggests that this is something that has happened more often, and really shows that it's a good idea for you to keep doing studies, not to just rely on one set of results before you draw a conclusion. And then, it's quite a good idea to look at all the evidence and maybe change your mind if that's where the numbers are showing you. And now, in the future, they actually do want to keep doing that, and so not just, again, rely on this, but keep doing some more studies, because they feel that the patterns are persuasive, but not really definite. And so they want to have a larger sample size yet again, and one of the ways they can do this is not just testing more canines, but actually looking at a different type of DNA. So I mentioned nuclear DNA versus mitochondrial DNA. And with mitochondrial DNA, you've got about 20,000 different base pairs, so it's not the biggest of genomes. But with nuclear DNA, you've got about 2 billion base pairs, and this is a much larger fragment of DNA, so that gives you quite a lot more information, and you can test for a lot more similarities. And this allows you to really make sure that the similarities that you're finding are not just by chance, that they really do reflect the fact that things are closely related. And the unfortunate thing about this is that it can be quite hard to get nuclear DNA from ancient remains. However, there have been a lot of breakthroughs in this lately, and if you've listened to the show in the past, you'll know that I've talked about some Scandinavian researchers who've had a lot of success in looking at really ancient human samples and beginning to extract DNA from that. They're interested in using these techniques now to even potentially resurrect the woolly mammoth and extract DNA from old samples and put them into elephants. So we are making huge leaps forward in technology, and potentially some of these may allow the researchers to extract the nuclear DNA that they need in order to do more dog work and kind of understand exactly where did dogs come from, which species, what region, and kind of what's the context of that. So we'll just know more and more as they add all these little pieces to the puzzle. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Kathleen Edwards with Old Time's Sake. And the next recent science news story that I want to talk about is, again, something like the first story that deals with some really old samples. And in this case, it's not dogs, but cats. And this is the news that the oldest ever big cat fossils have now been found. And these are quite interesting because they are incredibly old, and they really extend our knowledge much further back in history than previously we'd been able to know anything about cats. And also it provides some evidence about where cats came from to begin with. So there's quite a lot of interesting stuff in this story. And to give you a bit of background, there are two closely related groups of large cats, the Pantherinae, which are the really big ones that include things like lions and jaguars, tigers, leopards, snow leopards, and also clouded leopards. And then there's another group that has other kind of, not tiny cats, but kind of mid to small size, and that's the Felinae. And this includes things like cougars and lynxes and domestic cats. And to date, the DNA evidence has suggested that these two groups diverged about 6.37 million years ago. However, until recently, the oldest fossils of the big cats, they were just some tooth fragments, they dated to only about 3.6 million years ago. So there were another 3 million years or so that were pretty much unaccounted for. So we had this kind of genetic evidence that suggested how old the cats were and when their ancestors were living, and when that divergence occurred, but we didn't have any actual physical samples to look at in order to get an idea of what these things might have looked like, whether our estimates were correct, or anything like that. However, researchers have just been on a paleontological dig in Tibet, and they have unearthed a skull that has been dated to about 5.95 to 4.10 million years ago. So this is a nice extension now from about 3.5 million years to another 1 or 2 million years beyond that, and it gets us much closer to that divergence time about 6.5 million years ago. And one of the kind of interesting things, if you know anything about how these things are dated, this was dated using a technique called magnetostratigraphy, and this is basically relying on the fact that these fossils are at a certain level in the substrate, and if you kind of assume that fossils are about the same age as the substrate in which they're lying, then you can find out something about that substrate and then get an idea, once you've aged that, of how old the fossil itself is. And what they can do with the magnetic technique is to look at the reversals of the Earth's magnetic field and how those are reflected in the sediments that are there in those layers of soil and layers of rocks. And once they get an idea of how many of those reversals have happened and the pattern and the aging of all that, they know all of this from lots of different records around the world, from ice samples, from rock samples all over the place. And so they're able to use that to then get an idea of how old the fossils themselves are. And that's what they did in this particular case. And what's nice about this is that the skull is not only much older than any other sample, it is a completely new species that's never been described before. And it's named Panthera blytheae, after the daughter of a couple that was providing financial support for the excavation, so that's a nice little reward for their financial help. And the location of the dig is quite an interesting kind of clue to a puzzle, the broader puzzle of where these big cats came from. So what we know is that there are a lot of big cats in Asia, but we never really knew exactly where they came from. And the fact that this skull was found where it was suggests that actually this might have been kind of a center of big cat evolution. And it was found in a border region kind of right between Pakistan and China. And it's approximately 7 days away from Beijing. It's on really bumpy country roads. It's totally out in the middle of a very inaccessible place. And it's the kind of place where there just weren't a whole lot of people living or traveling, and so it was able to kind of be there in an undisturbed way for probably quite a long period of time. And what likely happened here is that there was a river flowing through, passing by a cliff, and over time it eroded enough of the cliff that a bunch of the rocks and the mud fell down and exposed a big patch of fossils that had been kind of held captive all these years. And there were actually a bunch of different fossils. It wasn't just the one skull. There were about 100 other bones in total, and a lot of them were actually antelope bones, so it might have been that this cat that they found was living in a den perhaps, and it was eating things back there and then leaving the bones around. That's completely conjecture, but it does kind of make sense to find the big predator's skull as well as all the skull of a potential prey item. And the dig site is in a region that overlaps with the majority of the current big cats that we know today, which suggests that this ancestor would have been living there and given rise to all these other ones that could have evolved from that, or from other closely related species that were all living in that area in that era. And they could have probably evolved in this place in Central Asia and then spread outward to all the other places that we find these pantherines today. And another interesting thing about this study is that the finding has disproved a recent suggestion that Panthera and another group of cats, the Neophilus, which are the clouded lepers, that they split up approximately 3.72 million years ago. So simply finding this one single fossil and knowing its age and knowing the fact that it even just exists automatically indicates that this split didn't happen when people thought that it happened. And obviously the researchers are really interested in going back to this site and investigating it in further detail in the future, because it obviously is kind of a treasure trove and there seem to be a lot lying around. So hopefully if they go back, they can find some more and maybe get more pieces of this same type of species, so they can get a broader idea of what its body was like, because who knows how big or how small it might have been. Maybe they can go and find other species, maybe they can go and find other individuals. So there obviously could be quite a lot more that they could go find if they go back to this region. Now, since I'm on the topic of really old things, I'll give you one more tidbit, recent science research about some really old stuff. And in this case, I'm talking really, really old, so practically to the beginning of the Earth itself. And this is the finding that there is a recent complex ecosystem that has been uncovered. Well, I say recent, it has recently been uncovered, but it is very much not a recent ecosystem, because actually it dates back to about 3.5 billion years, and it was unearthed in some sedimentary rocks in Australia. And specifically what the researchers have found in Australia is something called MISS, M-I-S-S, which stands for microbially induced sedimentary structures. And these were unearthed in a portion of Western Australia that is quite interesting from the perspective of people who are interested in early evolution of life, because it's called, so this area is called the Pilbara district, and it has all these things that are probably representative of what the earliest life on Earth was like. So one thing that you can find here are stromatolites, and these are mound-like deposits that were created by ancient photosynthetic bacteria. And I actually had no idea what these were until I think I must have been a master's student or a PhD student even, and I was reading a book in which someone kind of offhandedly referred to these structures. And they are a really odd sort of thing, and they're not the most picturesque of things, but they're quite an interesting sort of concept. And so when I went to Australia a few years ago, I really wanted to go see these things because they are so unusual. It is kind of like looking back in time and thinking about what the Earth would have been like billions of years ago. And so I made a point to go see them. And it is quite unremarkable in many ways. You're standing there just looking at a bunch of mounds kind of stretching off into the distance in an unhospitable kind of habitat with lots of saline, kind of unpleasant water that you'd never want to go swimming in. But it is really, really neat because it is quite a lot like those pictures that you see of the early Earth and of the very beginnings of life as it would have emerged in the water and then kind of eventually spread to land. So you do kind of get the sense that you're standing on an alien planet or that you've gone back in time. So this is actually quite an exciting thing, even though it sounds, kind of boring, because who really cares about microbes? But these MISSs are kind of an exciting thing because they're formed from mats of microbial material. So it's not just individual organisms, but it's actually a bunch of different organisms that are growing together and working together. And it's the same sort of thing that you might find on stagnant waters or in coastal flats. It's these kind of aggregations of little microbes that will come together and function together as a unit. So as you can imagine, that's kind of a precursor, really, to the sorts of more complex systems that we have in our bodies today. So this is the kind of thing that made life possible. So that's one of the reasons why it is such an exciting finding. And in this area of Australia, there are all these sorts of things like stromatolites, also microfossils. So you can find evidence of bacteria in the fossil record, which you wouldn't even think is a possible thing. But even though they've seen all these things and known about them for years, they had never found the MISSs, that's really hard to say, in this region. And so this is the first time that they have been located in this area. And they were found in a rock feature that's called the Dresser Formation. And the researchers did a bunch of chemical analyses on these in order to find out whether the materials that they had seen, which looked like they were these MISSs, but they weren't sure, so they had to do these tests to see if they were biological in origin, and of course they were. And they were quite similar in morphology and also level of preservation to some similar samples that were found in younger rocks that had been located elsewhere. So for example, they looked quite a lot like the remnants of a 2.9 billion year old ecosystem that was recently discovered in South Africa. So we do know that these were living in multiple different places around the world several billion years ago. And all of this stuff really provides overwhelming evidence that there were complex mat-forming microbial communities that were dating back to much longer than we would have previously thought. And actually, before they found this new MISS, the oldest one was about 300 million years younger than this one. So this has, again, kind of bumped back these origins of certain types of life and certain ways in which life grow. And if you have been listening recently, then you'll know I've made several references to some studies that have bumped back when oxygen was first produced and put into the atmosphere, also when flowering plants first evolved. And so little by little we're finding all of these samples that are indicating that things were progressing much faster and much earlier than we thought here on Earth, which probably is not, we aren't discovering this because we haven't been looking in the past. It probably has a lot to do with the fact that our techniques are now so much more sensitive. We have technology that allows us to test things that we couldn't test in the past and in different ways. And so we're simply finding out more about these things than we ever could have before. And all of this, really provides a window on ancient conditions, how life would have evolved, and what the conditions were that were needed for life to evolve, and how these things might have begun to gain some of the functions that we now see them having. And when we know all of this stuff, we can kind of get an idea of how bacteria might respond to certain things that we would do to them, certain changes in the atmosphere, certain drugs that we might take, and thinking about characteristics that we do and don't want them to evolve, things that could be harmful to us or helpful to us. So understanding all of this process and all of these ways that they interact with each other and with the environment can really be quite a useful thing, as well as just interesting if you kind of like to think about history and life on Earth. And in this case, the researchers think that probably these structures that they found were a byproduct of the interactions between the bacteria and the shoreline sediments. And so, this is a real indication of what happens when the bacteria are interacting with their environment. And of course, when we know all these sorts of things, we can not only apply it to life here on Earth, but also potentially finding life elsewhere. And in fact, MISSs are one of the things that scientists are hoping that the Mars rovers might eventually uncover, and any rovers that are sent elsewhere as well. So if they can look for these sorts of things in sedimentary samples, then maybe we can find out that even if there isn't life there today, there might have been life there in the past. And this is quite an exciting thing, because you can use this as a benchmark really anywhere in the solar system and look for these things and get an idea of whether we're really alone or not. And so even if these aren't kind of the little green men that we all think of when we think of kind of Hollywood-style aliens, they are really easy signs that we could use to search for these things that are much more likely to have been the sorts of forms of organisms that might be found on the planets elsewhere in our solar system. Welcome back to The Wild Side. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Endlessly by Duffy. And today on this show, I am talking about some recent findings in the scientific literature. And the next study that I want to talk about, just like the one I was discussing before the break, has to do with bacteria. And this one also actually is about bacterial evolution. And in this case, some researchers at the Michigan State University in the U.S. have been growing some bacteria for 25 years straight in their laboratory. And this is quite a long time in the life of a bacterium, so it's about 50,000 generations. And what they have recently reported is that basically it looks like the evolution of bacteria has no foreseeable end. And they have been growing these things in vials all this time and then kind of testing them against each other from different generations to try to get an idea of whether the more recently evolved ones are kind of better equipped to breed and to do well in life than the ones that were grown up longer ago. And they expected at some point that there would kind of be a peak and that they wouldn't keep seeing these things get better and better. But in fact, what they found is that they just keep improving and improving and improving. And so this is the result that they have recently announced to the press. And what's quite interesting here is that they've kept the environment constant. And they assumed that if you keep the environment constant, eventually there's not going to be any need to create new adaptations, because you don't have to kind of keep adjusting to things. Your body would find the best combination of genes, the best way to be, the best way to do things, and that would simply be that. And so there wouldn't be any evolution once you do finally reach that peak. And this is kind of a general assumption that a lot of biologists have, that basically in order to have this kind of change in success and in fitness, you are going to have some sort of external fluctuations in order to drive that, in order to drive the need to have these changes and for the need for these mutations to be kept around in the population. But the bacteria, as I said, are still becoming more fit after all of this time, and this suggests that they're continuing to move towards what researchers call a fitness peak, which is the state where you've got a population that has just the right set of mutations and can't really get any better, because if they mutate one more thing, it's actually going to be kind of a trade-off. So it might be good for one thing but worse for another, and so it's just not going to get any better. And when I'm talking about fitness here, I am talking about, kind of the ability to reproduce, to live as long as you can and reproduce as much as you can within that time frame, and to have that happen within your offspring as well. And as I kind of mentioned at my little summary at the beginning, these researchers have been freezing samples from each generation over those 50,000 generations and 25 years. And they take them out of the deep freezer and then kind of compete them against the more recent samples in order to see which is the most fit. So if they take the old ones and put them in the same environment as the new ones, then whichever one is able to reproduce more, basically, within a given time frame, those are the ones that are more fit. And so what they found is that the newer bacteria are always more fit than their predecessors. And this suggests that the peak that they're looking for has not yet been reached. Now, they have found that the bacteria are not speeding up that slope as much as they had been in the past. So they were really kind of rushing up to the peak, and now it's much slower of a progression, but they are still on the upward trajectory. And this suggests that perhaps they're running out of improvements to make. So maybe it's, the mutations that they're having are now more and more deleterious, and so that, that's killing off a bunch of bacteria that have those changes. Maybe there are just fewer genes left that they can manipulate in some kind of favorable way. Or maybe not. Maybe this is just kind of a temporary thing. Who knows? So these data were then used to build a model that predicted, can't spit that out, the evolutionary trajectory that would be observed in these bacteria. And so you can take all those numbers of, kind of how many changes they're seeing and how fit one generation is relative to another, and you can use that to make a very general model that can be used in relation to other species or in other environments or with other characteristics that you might be looking at. So they're hoping to build this general model that can be applied in lots of different ways. And this would allow them to potentially think about how fit could certain things ultimately become? Over what time scales might we observe these sorts of changes? And all of this sort of information can be more and more specific as you add in more and more complex data. So obviously the model that they've got right now is quite simple, is quite general, but if we know about other life history traits, and if we continue the study and make the model more complex over time, then you can begin to get a much more specific idea about these kind of fitness characteristics and the time scale over which this happens. And all this is kind of generally interesting, but also quite applicable if we're thinking about things that are out there in the wild, the organisms that are living within us. So it kind of has conservation implications and medicine implications. So there are lots of reasons to be doing these things, as well as just kind of, finding out about nature and about how things work. And the lab really hopes that they can get an endowment so that this research experiment that they're doing can continue indefinitely. So generations down the line, we might have a second group of researchers, a third group, whatever, continuing this life's work of this one research lab, so that they get this really mammoth sample of decades of our work and generations of the bacteria. Now, the next story I want to talk about is changing tack a little bit, but kind of is about something that I spoke about a couple weeks ago here on the show, and that has to do with tree pests and diseases. And you might remember that I was talking about phytopathology and kind of what sorts of diseases we have emerging in plants and why it's important to know about that and kind of the implications of those sorts of diseases. Well, right on the heels of reading up on all of that and sharing it here on the show, some researchers have released a new study that analyzed kind of the number of pests and the number of disease outbreaks around the world, and they found that they have been increasing in recent years. And what's interesting is that, so I did kind of refer to that a little bit in my radio show. But what they've done here is they've looked not just at specific trees, but also entire forests. And so they've kind of done it over a different scale than some of the previous research has been done. And it's a pattern that has been observed right here in the UK, which is where the researchers are based, but it also is reflected around the globe as well. So just a couple of examples are things like Dutch elm disease, which was a problem several decades ago, but more recently things like the ash fungus. And of course, as I mentioned previously, the spread of these diseases is facilitated by increasing globalization, among other things. And this helps move diseases into new areas, and it also allows diseases to contact each other and exchange their genetic material. And it allows these things to become more pathogenic and more virulent and more problematic. And of course, this is something that impacts not just the tree species themselves and the ecosystems in which they are living and all the other organisms that depend on those trees, but also humans, because there are a lot of ecosystem services that trees and forests do for us. So they provide timber and food and provisioning and carbon sequestering and carbon storage as well, reducing flood risk, and of course we go and use them in a kind of leisure capacity. So there are lots of reasons to care about the fact that trees are having all of these infections recently. And clearly all this indicates that we need to determine some more management approaches that take into account the fact that globalization is an issue, climate change is an issue, there are lots of services that these plants provide for us, and we need to take those into account. And we need to also think about the fact that there are different stakeholders involved in all of this. And so clearly the management implications are very complex, and we have to be quite innovative, I think, in coming up with some ways to address this. And the researchers of this particular study were saying that, it's not very easy to identify potential pest species before they actually become a problem. But what we can do is focus on the pathways of introduction. And this is one of the things that they were looking at in their paper, was to think about how all the diseases that we know about have come to be a problem, and so use that information to project what sorts of diseases and what types of pathways might be problematic in the future. So for example, places that are along trade routes are more likely to be impacted. Places that are near where there are lots of travelers, places that tend to have lots of invasive species. So we can kind of project and pinpoint the areas and the species that are most likely to be impacted, and then kind of maybe put some measures into place ahead of time that will prevent problems from happening. And in particular, as I mentioned in the previous radio show, we really need to prevent the introduction of new species. And that's the species that are the diseases themselves, or the species that maybe carry those things and can introduce them into new areas. So there are lots of different species that could be problematic, whether directly or indirectly. And things that we might want to think about are mitigation measures like biocontrols and also breeding of resistant species. And, it can be kind of dangerous if humans meddle in that way, but it also can be incredibly helpful and may ultimately be the only way to kind of undo the damage that we've facilitated. But of course that is quite a moral and ethical thing that we'll need to talk about as a society. And one of the things that these researchers really advocate is not just knowing about a system in part, but kind of understanding it all the way. So thinking about what is the molecular basis of this infection, how does the actual microbe work on the plant that's infecting, and then knowing about all the repercussions of that infection all the way up to the community and the landscape level. So really getting the big picture of that whole infection and thinking about how you can address that entire thing and not just one stage in that whole process. And one of the points that I thought was really interesting about this study was that they point out that there are lots of places that have infections where there's no real clear owner of the natural resource, and there are multiple people who are benefiting from and using that area. So how do you figure out how to value those sorts of services that aren't owned, they aren't insured? There's no clear way to put a dollar price or pound price on them. And so we need to try to figure out a way of doing that so that we can kind of work together to preserve these things in a fair way, so that no one person or entity is bearing all of the burden, especially since a lot of us are kind of cumulatively involved in helping introduce certain things and do certain practices that can be unhealthy for the trees. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was Swift-John Stevens with All the Trees of the Field Will Clap Their Hands. And the last study that I want to talk to you about tonight on this recap of recent science news is one in which researchers have created a global forest change map. And this is quite a huge process that involved a multi-organizational research team that not only was kind of academic in nature, but also involved people from Google Earth. So it's a really neat example of how people from lots of different industries can come together in order to do science and create scientific results. And what these guys did was pool their resources in order to create a high-resolution global map that shows how much of the world is covered by forest and how much of that forest has been lost over time, but also how much forest has been gained over time. And they did this by collecting satellite data that covered the period of 1992 to 2012. And this included about 650,000 separate images, and all of these were harvested from a large government database that is freely available to anyone. And the images show kind of the effects of lots of different environmental factors, so things like logging and fire and disease and also storms and, whether it's human or natural, the sorts of things that can impact how much forest there is. And they took all of these data to the people at Google Earth Engine, and they had created these models that allowed them to harvest this information from all the images, to kind of stitch them all together and to think about where each place was and what the impact had been that had made forests grow or shrink and how much area that covered. So all this sorts of quantitative stuff that they wanted to get out of the images. They had this really nice model to process all of that, but they didn't have the computer power to do so. So the analysis, if it had been one single computer doing this, it would have taken 15 years to perform all of the research. But when they took it over to Google, the Google array managed to do it in just a few days, which is really phenomenal. And so what they did was take all of this and get all that information out of it and then kind of produce these fine resolution, 30-meter kind of resolution maps that already covered 1 decade and can be updated annually very easily because it's quite repeatable kind of model to run, and look at information that's globally consistent. So you're able to, every single region was calculated in the same way. All countries had data calculated in the same way, but it's also locally relevant because it is such a fine scale, so you can really zoom in at really high resolutions as well. So this is a really amazing tool that they've managed to produce. And one of the nice things about this is that typically in the past, this sort of stuff, when they had these data, they were from governments themselves, and people would kind of estimate things and then send in the information. And those estimates were never really all that powerful because they often were a bit flawed. And so this allows the researchers to really do some analyses and look at this forest data in a much more accurate way. And what they found was that between 2000 and 2012, we've lost about 888,000 square miles of forest around the world. However, also in the same period, we gained about 800,000. So even though there was quite a lot lost, there was also quite a lot gained, although of course there is a net loss if you look at those two different numbers. And they found that the tropics were the only area that exhibited a clear trend. And what they found, unfortunately, was that forest loss was found every single period throughout the study. And so it was about 811 square miles per year that was lost in these regions. And deforestation used to be really, really bad in Brazil, but is now much better. And you could see that in the numbers, but what you can see is that this is offset by an increase in loss elsewhere. So places like Southeast Asia and South America, where tropical forest is really vanishing. And it was amazing to see the Brazilian data actually, because the decrease in loss there was the largest of any single country. So they had this effort and they did a really good job with it. The government has really been able to achieve these goals that they set out. But in places like Indonesia, they found it was just a really dire story. So loss was doubling over the study period, for example. The subtropics had a really high rate of change overall, and this was related to intensive forestry practices in particular. Also quite high levels of change in the American Southeast, actually even higher levels than in the South American rainforests. And this doesn't just necessarily represent a loss, it's both loss and regrowth. So it's just huge changes of lots of forests being taken down, but also lots of forests being grown. So just quite a lot of turnover in these regions. Now the places that had the highest rates of loss were Paraguay, Malaysia, and Cambodia. And Paraguay had the highest loss to gain ratio, so they're really doing quite poorly in terms of keeping their forests intact. And of course a lot of that does have to do with poverty in the region and the fact that a lot of people can go in and make a lot of money by logging, and so that is what they tend to do in these areas. And the implications of all this, I kind of referred to this a little bit in that last story I talked about. When you're losing your forests, of course this has an impact on climate regulation, on carbon storage, on biodiversity, on water supplies. And because we know all of this information in a very specific geographical way, we can really have much better guesses as to where these things are going to be problems and where you can target certain areas in order to try to cut those problems off before they really start to emerge. So for example, with these maps, we now know the location of the largest intact natural forest. We see where the biodiversity is most threatened, and we also can kind of get a sense of how well people are doing when they do try to reduce forest loss. So for example, we see that the efforts in Brazil worked quite well, but we also can see that places like Indonesia that had a moratorium on logging licenses, clearly that wasn't working all that well because there was that doubling of forest loss over the time of the study. So they're able to use these data that are now available to each nation, so that means that all these governments can look at these numbers themselves and make their own decisions and try to work together to protect their forests and maybe through the UN or other international bodies protect other forests that are shared across national boundaries. So this is quite a landmark achievement that these guys have made. And on that rather positive note, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the show for today, and I'm going to end with a song by the Lone Bellow. Again, another positive note, Tree to Grow. So I will talk to you next week.